There we go. So I'm going to say it just for. So my name is Porfirio Figueroa, and I am the Deputy Director of Community Affairs for the Manhattan Borough President's Office. Welcome. You have an R in the Combating Implicit Bias session for the Leadership Training Series for 2025. We have an amazing speaker this evening. And before I introduce her, I do want to say something about the Perception Institute, if I may. The Perception Institute is a consortium of researchers, advocates, and strategists who translate cutting edge mind science research on race, gender, ethnic, and other identities into solutions that reduce bias and discrimination and promote belonging. They work in sectors where bias has the most profound impact, such as education, healthcare, media, workplace, law enforcement, and civil justice. Their vision is to work towards a world that is free from discrimination and other harms linked to cultural and social identity differences. Again, I cannot say enough. Afua Ado is the Deputy Director of Programs and Training at the Perception Institute, a trauma focused mental health specialist who specializes in the intersection of trauma, justice, and equitable trauma informed service provision, a nationally recognized advocate. AFWA supported White House roundtables in 2015, 2016, intervening public systems, interrupting the sexual abuse to prison pipeline, and has administered training to over 20,000 people. AFWA created municipal, state, and federal training curricula and has successfully created court based programming to transform approaches to gender based violence and address the needs of system involved women and youth within the New York State Unified Court System. She has consulted with A Call to Men, Women's Prisons Association, and the Southern Poverty Law Center, and is on the board of Girls for Gender Equity. She commits her time and efforts to the distribution and improvements of oppressive systems, with an emphasis on leveraging the expertise of the disenfranchised and overlooked. Her work seeks to remove hierarchical oppression by working with leaders, facilitating dialogue through differences, building cross group awareness, and providing proven results in personal engagements, corporate accountability, and mission realignment. We are really thrilled to have our speaker, Afua Ado, back for the second year in a row. And with all pleasure, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Porfirio and Dawn, for being so patient, for all of you for being patient. I promise that our time together this evening will be engaging and hopefully enlightening, but more so grounding. So thank you, Porfirio, for inviting a deep breath, because we do need that after the frenzy of balancing technology and our humanity. That's really why I'm here today, because I
Thank you.
kind
One
of
more thing I want to say: the chat is disabled. However, you have the power, if you want, if you have a question, to have the ability to have people chime in, or we can take, and we will most certainly take questions at the end. So I just wanted to
Awesome,
say that.
awesome. Yes, there is actually one or two places where I usually ask people to share in the chat, but for the purposes of our time today, it actually does serve us better to self-reflect and kind of do that work on our own, and keep the ball in the air. I will invite your voices into somewhat of a chorus in a way. I see some of y'all might be in offices and maybe even in commute, but like I said, let me just get into the thick of things. I have a couple of slides to support what I'm going to share with you. I'm going to be crisscrossing between some sectors. So let me just start by saying I am a New Yorker. I'm a proud New Yorker. What? Oh, I said it told me that I had just been kicked off. Sorry about that. That's why my face went blank. I'm a proud New Yorker, but I'm a even prouder Brooklynite. It is always an honor to work with fellow New Yorkers and folks who are supporting keeping our city running. We are at the precipice of some real major shifts in our city. So hopefully what will share today will help build some context around how we process the world around us, what's happening in the news, what's happening at larger administrative and political levels, but also just what happens in our day-to-day interactions, how that informs our work, More importantly, how it informs our interpersonal interactions, right? So from being on the subway, from being in crowded areas with one another, to working on teams with one another, to being a neighbor, and ultimately to being a citizen of this society. How do we do this? How do we pass adequate behavior and ideas of fairness and equity along to our young people and to our children? What is the next generation going to do? And so the Perception Institute is, as Porfirio shared, a small organization that works with the University of California, Berkeley Othering and Belonging Institute. And what we do is we translate neuroscience um, data, content, ongoing studies and research around how the brain and identity, how the brain processes identity, and also how identity informs our decisions when it comes to major impacts, such as making a decision that impacts someone else's life. You might see that if you've been on jury duty, or if you are part of a clinical team and you are conducting a case conference, that decision will ultimately impact someone else's life, as well as what happens when we are in these spaces, when we're in nonprofit spaces, philanthropic spaces, direct service or social impact, social justice spaces. We are primed with making decisions that impact other people's lives. And what happens to us in those experiences impacts how we make those decisions, how we talk to one another, how we email one another. So hopefully, some of the studies I share with you today, some of the overviews will make some sense. I'm realizing that I'm sitting in kind of direct line of the sun. It is bright. We're fortunate that it's been as bright as it has been on the East Coast since the Northern Lights hit us. So if it becomes a little too overbearing, someone let me know and I'll move into something darker, but I'm kind of enjoying um,
No, you are in
this
radiant
light.
light, not to worry.
Oh, okay. Look at you, just being so kind. So you all are kind. I'm appreciating these accolades. We begin. I want to provide a bit of an agenda for how I'm going to navigate through this work today, and also share some context for what you'll be seeing. I always like to bring people into my work as it's like the active work. Where we are active right now is real estate, and fair, not specifically real estate, but fair housing. We're also active in education, as well as my colleague Rachel Godsill, who helped found the Perception Institute, is working directly in civil rights law with some of the cases that have been brought against on current administration. But right now, this work right here, you see kind of in the gray there on your screen, that reads historical context of fair housing underneath how we got here. And I share that with you because what we'll be talking about today is an introduction to bias behavior, how the human body processes identity. And in subsequent to that, following that I'll be addressing three attributes of the mind science of bias, how the mind science of bias is the neuroscience of bias: implicit, identity anxiety, and stereotype threat, as well as some of the interventions to combat them and ways in which we can interrupt that. But then also taking a look at how this bias leads to harm. As a mental health clinician, I'll talk a little and a lot about trauma because they are concentric dynamics in our lived experiences. And then, of course, strategies, not just to override bias, but to mitigate it if you're experiencing it in the moment. I think it's also important that I share with you the goal and how this will land for you. I often tell people that I got my start um, in this work writing curriculum, writing trauma-informed curriculum for judges in the New York City area. And that was after I worked in direct service and anti-human trafficking. And so you'll see kind of the trajectory of how my career came into place, but also how this work impacts us as human beings. I was working in anti-trafficking, providing direct court advocacy to our youth here in the five boroughs who were arrested on charges related to prostitution. And I discovered that a great deal of the legal stakeholders managing their cases did not have an awareness of how these young people were both experiencing the court system, were experiencing their treatment both in bondage or under trafficking, and then also those experiences that led to their uh, degradation, or ultimately led to them being trafficked and being abused, right? And so developing a pipeline for education is how I came to this work. But I had to also address the history of bias in this country, the history of discrimination, and ultimately we're looking at the history of trauma. So I'll be navigating, right, how history and discrimination lends to our biased ideas and perceptions. Again, how implicit bias might result in unfair treatment and harm, not just unfair treatment from one person to another, but the harm experienced by someone in the moment, and even someone who's in the room, right? That vicarious harm, as well as identifying and sharing with you interventions and why they work, right? What is happening to the human body and the brain processing information differently. And hopefully this will inform how we show up in our work moving forward. I shared with you a couple of seconds ago that when I engaged judges and magistrates, defense bars, prosecutors, that work shifted in 2020 when we were hit with the global pandemic. And New York City had some of the highest, of course, we all were probably here. And if you remember, our emergency rooms, our triage centers were bottlenecking and deluged with a lot of foot traffic, a lot of that based on some of the historical relationships of certain communities with healthcare, and of course, with the way in which information was shared. But also, um, at that time, perception, my role morphed into supporting direct service clinicians. So I went from the legal stakeholders right to folks who were actively engaging the public on a daily basis. And we had to provide anti-bias training on a consistent basis because of what the brain requires in order to override biased behavior. In that instance, clinicians need to be reminded almost daily that their brains harbor bias and that they can override it, right? And that this would improve healthy outcomes throughout our city. And one final note I want to share is that following that training and that work in 2020 and 2021, the New York City jury duty video was presented and is now aired at 110 Center Street and throughout New York State. And that video is also presented to prospective jurors so that they too are aware of the bias that their brain harbors, so that when they are then primed with making an important decision that impacts someone's life, they can be aware that they may harbor some bias in that decision making. Thank you for sitting through that to kind of pipeline overview. I'm trying to fit as much information into the lost time that we have or that we don't have. But in our time together today, I'm inviting you to be present, recognize that there is certainly we all lead with good intentions, but at times, based on different experiences, the impact of what can be said or how it's shared might land differently than our intentions. And so thank you for disabling the chat, because that's usually where some of these infractions happen. And then, of course, I'm acknowledging that we all come to this moment with very different lived experiences. And because it's the end of the day, I'm going to invite you to not watch anything heavy tonight, to refrain from conversations about politics and identity, right? Focus on the meal that you're about to have, the people in your life, and hopefully on getting a good night's rest, or maybe even sinking your teeth into a good movie or some sports this evening. That is just to help process how we help you navigate how we process really heavy content or hard to hear content as well. And then ultimately your goals for today. I'm inviting you to think about what you could stand to learn. If you've sat through something like this before, if it sounds boring, if something can be missed, maybe you can show up in this work. I'm always open to collaborating with folk. I always love to add to the curriculum. And so if anything is missed, or if there's an aspect of your lived experience or your work experience that can be added, but also where can you grow, right? When did you find yourself becoming a little uncomfortable? Pay attention to those notes throughout our time this evening. I'm going to shift into getting you to think a little bit about how you came into acknowledging your own identity. And I often start with group connection and invite people to share out in small groups or share with the person near them, or just think for yourself. Which identity do you remember becoming aware of first? I'm hitting pause because when I first started doing this work, I had one answer and it's morphed into something, of course, as I start remembering a little bit more about my childhood. But I invite you to think about your identity that you was either named for you. Many people think back and say, oh my gosh, I was so young. I don't know that I declared that memory. And you don't have to. But just think about how you became aware of it, where you were, who made you aware of it, and how you do you remember how you felt about it? For myself, I don't know exactly which identity specifically the memory pops up first for, but I do remember a very specific and important conversation my grandmother had with me about being a girl. Now, I think another identity that I became aware of much earlier was that of a sister because I have siblings, and so I was aware that there were other people in the house or people for me to play with. But I remember becoming aware of my identity as a girl and that that was different than the boys in my family. I grew up, I was a first daughter and a first granddaughter and a first niece. And so by the time I came along, all of my boy cousins were just happy to have an extra person to play football with or an extra person, to throw in a corner to out in the outfield. And so there was this moment, I guess, about 7 or 8, when my grandmother was like, "You don't need to be running out in the field with those boys. Why don't you just come sit down?" I don't remember what I was wearing, if I had a dress on or whatever have you. But again, think about the identities you remember becoming aware of first. And it's important to note, I'm not asking you to name it, so to speak, and I'm also not asking you to connect to a pain point, but to think about how you became aware of yourself, what it was from people outside of yourself that made you aware that either you were different or you were alike in some regard. I also invite you to think a little bit about your role in social impact work, in social justice work, in direct service work, wherever you are in the organization of supporting this great city. Oftentimes, our roles are as guides because you harbor a great deal of information and you know more than the general public might know based on your proximity to power and your proximity to authority here in the city. But at the same time, right, one can often be a gatekeeper. One can harbor and hold on to information because everyone may not need to know something at the same time or in the same way. But your role as a guide or a gatekeeper is greatly informed by this identity that I just asked you to think about. It's greatly informed, or there's a lot of what you bring to your work every day that informs how you communicate with others. And so I do think this is an important place to pause for a moment and think about what your role is as a public servant or as a citizen of this city. Do you find yourself guiding and supporting and providing information or gatekeeping, right? Kind of, and gatekeeping doesn't have to be negative, altogether negative, but something to think about too, in our roles, again, in serving the public. I invite you to think about that role because the road to understanding and navigating bias is, in short, acknowledging and addressing the fairness paradox in this nation, right? The fact that so many of us hold on to ideals and values of fairness, and that as at the core of America, we want everyone to experience this fairness. This is where we are right now. It's really important, tense point in this nation. Actually, it's been tense for the last 5 years, but that the lived experiences of others is not the same. Right. I'm wondering if I should lower the shade on my end just to be fair, but I'm happy to keep going. So you all just let me know if I need to pause because it's hard to see. Um, this fairness
We do
paradox.
want you to be comfortable, so whatever
I'm
works. Yeah.
as long as you can see me, I'm fine with it. It's like I said, it's been a long time since we've had this much sun in New York, so I'm gonna just embrace it and reflect it back onto you all, and for those of you who can't see the sun. Ultimately, right, holding on to values of justice and equity and fairness is where we all want to be. But we acknowledge, right, we as New Yorkers, and I'm going to keep referencing this because we are unique to the rest of the nation in that on a daily basis, we might both experience some unfair treatment and also might be guiding and navigating the experiences of others relative to their identity. Understanding and acknowledging how bias happens in our lived experiences helps get to a point where we can hopefully address the conversation, or at least to start the conversation on how we resolve the paradox. I'm going to move swiftly through this because it's pretty intuitive, our foundational principles. And again, it's a lot of fodder, a lot of information, but it's really the same, right? What it takes. These are evidence-based foundational principles, right? What it truly takes for people to feel comfortable in a space when they're underrepresented or when it is diverse. I'm going to invite you, though, to think about the following. On the right, excuse me, on the left, I have this category of race, ethnicity, and I want to be clear, racial categorization, right? Ethnic category, right? Because I am acknowledging that we are a human race, but that there are these divisions and these divides that have been existing for the last 400 plus years that's continued to impact our daily lived experiences. Gender identity, sexual identity and presentation, religious affiliation, and ability and or difference. I would say also disability, right? Ability, disability, etc. And think about what's coming up. These 11 attributes or prompts on the right are asking, I am, and then you fill in the blank. I am, my race is, my ethnicity is, my language, my gender identity, sexual presentation, religious affiliation, and disability. And then two, my elementary school was mostly, this is fascinating because I actually have a junior high school reunion this weekend. It's going to be interesting to walk back into that space and see how homogenous my junior high school experience was compared to how diverse then my high school experience was. And so take a moment, look through these prompts and just get a sense of what is happening. What does your world look like? Is it more homogenous or more diverse? And I'm going to tackle this shade and get right back to you all. Take a look at this and I'll be right back. Okay. Did any of you discover anything? Or are you finding out something, or is something confirmed or surprising about your social circle, your family circle? Some people are surprised to find that things didn't change or that things have changed significantly. But again, bringing you into this conversation is really important because so much of how bias happens has a lot to do with what you've been told, taught, and then not corrected on over the years. So I want to share, I'm sorry, I'm going to just pause here, navigate around how we got here as a nation. The next slide has a lot of graphics on it. I don't mean for you to sit on that for a moment, but I do think it's important that you understand how we see where bias lives in how we navigate the America breakdown of society, okay? These winding arrows is what we would consider bias. That's what gets in the way of our ability to just properly navigate through institutions, our own identity, and our interpersonal relationships, and then how we see ourselves, right? And so the structure, these social inequities, social identities, your gender identity, where you live, which in America is dictated by class and racial categorization, historically race categories, and then how you interact with those institutions, right? How do you acquire the housing loan? How do you interact with the banks and um, the education system? How are you treated when you get to the school? What kind of school, right? What kind of healthcare do you have access to? And ultimately, what does it say about you? How do you feel when you interact with these different dynamics? And then what do you tell yourself? That individual on the side is usually what you come into the world with, or what your clan of origin, your family, the people who raised you, right? How they poured, what they have poured into you, and what ideas and notions you got from them. But the reason that's so small is because what happens very quickly when we start to attend school and about 4 and 5 years old is we are then heavily influenced by the world around us. I get this question, as you can imagine, all the time, all the time. And not just because the emphasis has been on race for so long, but because we have been separated from so much information about why America why racial categorization has such a stronghold in America. I'm not going to take you all back to 1672, but I do think it's important for you to look up Bacon as in Oscar Mayer Bacon, Bacon's Rebellion, to understand what happened at that time. Bacon was I think he would be considered an American revolutionary, but he was working on the docks down in the Maryland, Baltimore Harbor area. And at the time, he was working with um, descendants of newly arrived descendants of Africa, so a few Native Americans and indigenous folk, and then certainly some Europeans who had come over to settle in this new world. And his assembly around money, right, trying to obtain fair wages for the workers on the docks, is what led to a response from the higher ups, the crown even, to assemble an idea on how to build out a caste system. And so go back to Bacon's Rebellion there, and you will see the origins and really like the foundation of where racial categories came into place. However, the reason there is an emphasis on race is primarily because in these continental United States, race and racial categories and ethnicities have been the only characteristic by which inaccess, and discrimination to fair housing has been delineated and outlined, right? Um, Going as far back as 1918, I believe, where we see actual legislation and policy around race and access to home housing, and how that has evolved, or I don't really want to use the word evolved, but devolved over time, is that we have seen some areas in law and litigation where fair housing has been denied based on yes, ethnicity and religion, as well as a disability, which we didn't see kind of real legislation kick up until the 90s around the American Disabilities Act. But primarily in America, the first area where you will see dynamic redlining discrimination is at the start of fair housing, and as well as education, right? And then subsequent and almost by design, right, into healthcare. And so you can understand that my world is kind of concentric. I can't say for instance that implicit bias impacts one industry over another, or is more important to one industry or over another, because they work in tandem. And so I want to share this brief 3-minute video. It's part of what plays down at the jury duty video. It's not all of it, but it does concretize and summarize about 450 years of history into and as to why and how we've been taught what we're taught. It's called How the Irish Became White, based on a book written in the late 90s of the same name, about how ethnic identities, national identities morphed and shifted and really sacrificed their ethnic identities to align with whiteness in America. So I'm gonna play this for you now. Oops. Well, that didn't happen. So in the meantime, I'm going to pause just in case there are any questions before I deep dive. I want to be mindful of
If you have
time.
questions, you can put them in the Q&A, everyone.
Thank you.
Sure.
And I've got the video queued up. So whenever anyone has a question ready, we're ready to, I will come back and address that as soon as. Nope, that's not what I wanted. Never a dull moment in technology, right? Well, that's not. Okay. What do they tell you in showbiz? Just keep smiling, right?
I I think you're there. You hit.
Thank
You
you.
can.
Historical example, stereotypes and race. So one of the questions that's often confusing is why do stereotypes about some groups persist and
Okay, so
others disappear
Afwa,
into the dustbins
forgive
of
me.
history?
We hear it, but we can't see it. So it might be playing on a different. You're on mute. No,
I was just saying 1 second. I was asking which screen did you
it
see
it, it was on your
on my face?
no, yeah. It was on the PowerPoint presentation. Like, but we could hear what it was saying, but nothing was on the screen. So I don't know if you could access it separately and then share your screen.
Yes. It was an MP4, so
Yeah.
that I saw that.
We're gonna get it. Do you see the screen now?
We see you.
Oh, you just see me. Okay. I mean, the world wouldn't be the world if we could rely solely on technology. And you still see me now?
Yes.
I'm sorry. I really want to diversify the screen so you see more than just me. Uh, I'm going to I don't want to waste too much time with this, and I apologize again, for the technical difficulties. So I also want to name that Google has been down for the last like 72 hours, as well as Canva, which is where the uh, the application lives. So made it a little bit challenging to get into both Zoom and Canva and Google Drive, which is where everything lives. So you all are being incredibly kind to hang on. Ah, you can see it now, right?
Yes.
There we go.
Historical example, stereotypes and race. So one of the questions that's often confusing is why do stereotypes about some groups persist and others disappear into the dustbins of history? So I'm Irish Catholic. May not be obvious because of my name or the way I look, but Irish Catholics, particularly poor or working class Irish Catholics, were at one point dehumanized. We were seen as savage, uneducable. We were women promiscuous. But those stereotypes don't really exist anymore in people's minds. There's only one that people think about and attribute to the Irish, and that frankly has everything to do with drinking. And with that one, it's not a stereotype that actually affects any of us who are Irish as individuals. No one says, oh, we'll invite Rachel to do the lunchtime talk, but not the after dinner talk, because who knows what she would have done. No one does that.
Afwa,
Where did the
we can hear
stereotypes
it, but
go?
we can't
What?
see it. So I
Still
don't
can't
know if.
see.
No, I mean, we're looking at a black screen, or
There it
now we can
goes.
see it. There it goes. Now we can see it. So wherever you are right now, we can see it. So just hit the go button.
Irish identity.
There we go.
The Irish became white, as did the other white ethnics. And that happened over time. It started largely with the war films from World War II, where you'd see, again, different white ethnics in the trenches fighting against the opposition as part of the American effort. And then after the war, that translated into some powerful government programs. The Federal Housing Administration and the Veterans Administration developed a program to guarantee loans for working class families to purchase homes. But there was a catch. Those loans were not available to people of color. If you were Black, Latinx, Hispanic, Asian, the guarantees for loans weren't available at all. And if you were a white family and you were interested in moving into an integrated neighborhood, loans weren't available to you either. How did this happen? Because there were maps. It's now called redlining, because the maps created segments that were different colors. And if you were in a section of a city that was integrated, it was literally covered over with red. And that meant that no loans were guaranteed for those neighborhoods. So families made a choice to benefit from the guaranteed loans. They had to choose to live in all white neighborhoods. All of this hardened residential segregation, where people who'd been white ethnics moved to suburbs with other white people, including Protestants, and people got to know each other. They had backyard barbecues together, they were in PTAs together, their children went to schools together. And so that's how the stereotypes that used to be really powerful basically disappeared into history. But those groups who weren't allowed into those neighborhoods, who didn't get those federally guaranteed loans, they had stereotypes that remained powerful. But those same stereotypes about having too many children, or being on welfare, or not speaking English, or taking jobs from real Americans, those stereotypes still exist, but they're imposed upon other groups. For example, if you look at a content analysis of what's on television news across politics, Fox News, MSNBC, the networks, all of these contain really high proportions of those stereotypes as imposed upon people seen as Hispanic or Latinx. And those stereotypes are the ones that we're still fighting today.
Right.
So the video ended.
I know. I'm coming.
Okay. Okay.
I'm coming. I'm just trying to get back to my to the
Got
button.
it. All right.
And bring you all into the are you seeing a screen now?
Yes.
Okay, great. And so again, that video really just summarized the nation's challenge and brought us current. We're in the process of developing new information. However, I do think it's important that we have that in the back of our mind, and also keep in mind that what we're going to talk about relative to bias and identity harm, identity anxiety, and stereotype threat have been studied for many years. It is recent years that they have been defined and given real attention and really funding, right, to really get a sense of what is happening to us in this nation. And it's really, really fascinating information. I also think it's important that at the same time that I'm sharing this information with you, if you are interested in learning, going deeper, to learn more research about the birth of entertainment in America, the birth of entertainment, the birth of television, the birth of radio, as well as the birth of sport and tournament when it comes to athletes and entertainment and celebrity as well. I am going to shift and get a little clinical here. Not too clinical, because I think it's important that you understand how much your brain is holding, everyone's brain is holding every single day, every minute, and every second. And so what we found out in studies about over 20 years ago is that the brain takes in 11 million bits of information per second. What that means is that right now you're not cognizant of all of the bits of information your brain is processing, but your body is processing some of that as well. So while you're not thinking about your body temperature, you're not thinking about your relationship from your core of your belly to the Earth's gravitational pull, your brain is processing that information. Your brain can only assign 40 bits of information with feelings, thoughts, and emotions. So you're only going to really be thinking about 40 bits. It's like those moments when you're like, did I leave the stove on? I've got to make sure I pick up this thing on the way home, or what's in my bag, and what's that thing itching me at the bottom of my shoe? And is that my sock, or is something, all of those bits of information, right? That's when only about 40 per second. However, additional studies look at gender, how gender affected, how birth order affect, how much information our brains process, parenting or being multitasked. In this moment, I'm going to invite you to look at to participate in the Stroop task. It invites you to look at the screen and state the color of the text as it appears on the screen. If you've done this already, please hold in for yourself what the little trick to this task is. But for the most part, I usually invite the room or the audience to unmute themselves and say this all at once. But for some of you who might be in places where you can't get too loud, feel free to keep this on mute and just watch and participate. I'm wondering though, if you are comfortable unmuting yourself, what I will do is invite you on the count of 3 to say the word hello. Please, just for the sake of having almost 70 people on this call, only say hello when I count to 3 and only start stating the words, the color of the text as it appears on the screen when they appear. Please don't ask me questions. Don't say hi to one another if you see a friend on, but just unmute and say hello when I hit 3. Okay? 1, 2, yes, for video?
I'm not sure everyone has the ability to unmute
That's
themselves.
okay. That's all right.
Okay,
We'll just
that's
go with whomever's on the call.
great.
Yes, thank you for that. But yeah,
Sure.
it's really a group activity but it's also a brain process, a brain teaser activity. So don't worry if you're not able to unmute yourself. I will get the gist. So on the count of 3, I'm gonna invite you to say hello. 1, 2, 3.
Hello.
Awesome. And here begins the task. Okay. So I see some of us weren't in chorus. So I'm going to say hello. 1, 2, 3, say hello. And as soon as you see the color on excuse me, see the color, the word on the screen, just state the color of the text as it appears on the screen. And I know it's just 2 of you. So you're going to be our testers for everyone else in the gallery. And that's okay. You're supposed to make a mistake. You can make a mistake when people are raising their hands, but I can't actually get to the chat box for video. If anyone has a question, can you read that to me, please?
We cannot unmute our abilities off, and I've
That's
already
all.
stated why. But so, just to reiterate, uh, do do the do it anyway, even though we can't hear you.
Do it anyway.
And
Yes.
Dawn and I are going to be sort of like the guinea pigs, so to speak.
Yes.
Yeah.
Dawn and Porfirio are going to be your guinea pigs. Don't worry, folks. If you do this at home, and I'm going to tell you at the end how you can do this with loved ones, okay? Here we go. 1, 2, 3.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay. All right. Porfirio, you got to stay on the unison.
Got it.
Don't
I'm on
worry.
it.
We're going to take a time. We're going to make this happen. And here we go. Just state the color as you see it appear on the screen.
Blue,
red,
red, green,
green, black.
green, red, blue,
black,
black,
red,
Together.
green, red,
Together.
blue,
blue,
Together.
green,
black,
red,
green, green, red,
black,
Together.
blue,
blue.
black.
Okay. What happened, Dawn? I lost you. What happened, Porfirio? Both of y'all. This is good. I hope your colleagues are watching. Some of them might be laughing, but not laughing at you. We're laughing with, right?
I
What happened?
have a
What
little advantage in that I've done this before, and so you're supposed to say the color, not what you're reading.
Oh, crap.
So
That's okay.
and the first time I completely read the words, not the color.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Now here's the tricky part. Well, not the trickiest part, but think about this. What did you learn? Do you remember what you learned first? Did you learn your colors first or your letters first?
that's
Colors.
well, technically, yeah, colors. Yeah, Dawn's
Right.
Yeah,
But you
yeah.
see how your brain, how you go. So, Porfirio, what were you about to say? You were about to say technically.
Yeah, I mean, even though, but then I learned to read, and so that I'm supposed to read what I see or say what I see. So that changed my perception to see the color first
Well,
and actually read the color.
so
So
right. So
yeah.
you learned your colors first. You were about 6 months. People in your life were showing you the orange and pointing to the sky. And you know color. You knew colors very, very early because as soon as your eyesight came into view, you were identifying colors between 3 and 6 months. However, when you learn how to read, 4 or 5 years old, or even earlier, right? 3, 4, you're identifying letters. You start to recite the alphabet something interesting happened when you started to both when you started to speak, but also when you started to connect speech and pattern recognition in numbers and letters. People around you started going, "Oh my gosh, she can read," right? And then you got to school, and the same thing happened. We all, majority of us went to school when we were still reading and around, right, and reading out loud for classmates. Something interesting happened to our bodies in that moment when you started to identify letters. You experience something called a social reward. Ultimately, your body also started to feel good. Some hormones were released because you were being rewarded for this behavior of identifying reading. Something else also happened because reading became so fundamental, literally, right, to your learning, growth, and development, that reading replaced color recognition, pattern recognition as your default behavior. So that's the reason why if you are on the subway or if you're on the highway or just walking down the street and you see a billboard and all the letters aren't in the billboard, you can still identify a word. You don't need to see all the letters in order to know what a word is, because reading became what they call rote in your brain. It's also the reason why if you are anywhere and you see letters, you will want to read. You know this if you have a toddler in your life, right? And they sit in the back seat anytime, they're always like, "What's that? What's that say?" Right? Because what has happened is there's now a human almost inclination to identify what you are supposed to know, which are letters. And that's what was happening as the colors were appearing on the text. Now, the other interesting part is your color recognition is still in your body and mind. It hasn't gone. And it's not even more complicated for you to identify color. It's just that when you do, you have to do something else. So I want you all to take a look around the room that you're in and try to identify a color without seeing the object that it is. Do you just see a blue and not a bag? Do you just see yellow and not a pillow? No, right? You see the color and its object. Object permanence evolved and developed. It's also lends a bit to undo the idea and the notion of color blindness. Color blindness is both not psychologically normative, it's not socially normative. It's impossible to see an individual and not see the identity with which they are most salient for them, right? Color blindness can't exist because the Stroop task identifies for us, or it indicates to us how our brain processes information when it's hyper stimulated. We're at the end of our day, right? You all have already done your work. So now that you know the task, take a look at the this next screen, and we're going to try it one more time. And again, you might make mistakes primarily because this is less about identifying and knowing your colors and your words. And I'm going to tell you why in a moment. Ready?
So are we still doing color?
We're going to do it one more time. We're going to do
Okay.
1, 2, 3, hello, and then you and Donna on for the rest of the gallery. Okay? Thank you for being the guinea pigs. 1, 2, 3.
Hello.
Hello.
Okay, here we go. And just blurt it out.
Blue,
Blue, red,
red,
green,
green,
black,
black, green,
black,
black,
red,
red,
green,
green,
red,
red, blue,
blue, black,
black,
red,
green,
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 red,
red,
blue,
blue,
black.
black.
Okay, great job. Now I'm showing y'all that it was not slowed down on my end, but you all slowed down and developed a rhythm and a cadence so that you could think through. And Dawn, I heard you actually like pausing to be thoughtful about what you were identifying on the screen.
Yes.
Amazing. But think about the people in our world who don't have an opportunity to slow folks down. Now, the
Pause.
reason I say, right. The reason I say not slow folks down, think of the words on the screen not as words, but as people coming through a turnstile,
Mm.
right? Coming through an emergency room, coming through a courthouse, coming into a school building in the morning, running through the MTA, right? How is someone supposed to evade just lumping people into categories? Take a look at this. If you can, try to identify how many triangles you can see in this figure. Right? Just think to yourself. I know, Porfirio, I know that you've done this before, but I'm gonna indulge the folks.
And I want to remind everyone that you can answer in the Q&A, so feel free.
Awesome, thank you so much. I'm going to speed this up a bit, and you can totally screenshot this page. You can take it home. If you've got teenagers or you got middle schoolers and you want to busy them for it's about an hour it will take them to answer this. The correct answer is that there are no triangles in this figure, because a complete triangle requires 3 complete angles, 3 equal sides, right? But you, in your heart of hearts, know that you don't have to see a full triangle to know what it is. You've seen triangles your whole life. This figure and this activity helps you understand that your brain categorizes information the way the Google Drive categorizes folders or organizes information. Remember the old file folders? You open a file and you'd have all those tabs and information. You've got that in your brain. Except in your brain, the categories and the files are separated into some things a little bit more dynamic. Usually it's based on what we know and what we don't know, and what we don't know is filled in by what we've been told or taught. And so the reason, I'm going to get to that in a moment. So the reason that implicit bias is so important to understand is because it's what happens when the brain has an instant automatic connection between stereotypes or your attitudes toward a particular group without your conscious awareness. Before you're even able to think about it, right? If you don't have information on an individual or a person or a body, you're going to have to fill it in with information. And if you've never met these people before, how would you know to fill this in? How would you know? Where would you get it from? Before I go into stereotype attitude and positive and negative ones about people, I want to ask you about early in the morning when you first get up. I often use the idea of going to get coffee or tea if you're not leaving the house like me, if you're not ultra lazy like I am, but if you really make it at home, right? When you're moving from the bedroom or the bathroom to the kitchen or through the living room, and you're doing multiple things, you're multitasking. You might have your cell phone if you have your technology early. You might step on a Lego, you might run into the pet, right? You might look for the news, whatever it is, right, in the morning. By the time you get to the kitchen to pour your coffee, to pour your tea, you might not be solely focused on that task. It might be something you're doing while you got the phone up to your ear, or while you're speaking on speakerphone, or you're listening to a podcast. Why is it then that when you take out your cup, we use it demonstrate, and go to pour water into, that you don't just like pour it into your pocket, or you don't take off your shoe to pour liquid into your shoe because you're so distracted, right? It's because you've seen coffee and tea being made ad nauseum. It's not necessarily because the behavior is something that your body is so used to. It's not a normal behavior to like, if you get sick or if you wake up out of I don't know, a deep slumber for many years, you're not going to wake up and automatically start making coffee and tea. That's not how that happens. What I'm saying though is that years and years ago, when you were a young person, a developing individual, you saw someone going through the motions of making their tea and coffee. We as children watch Disney have actual coffee dancing into coffee cups. That means that an actual stereotype was created around coffee and how it's drank. Because in other parts of the world, they drink coffee very different, in many different ways, right? So I'm stepping out of that, talking about an object. I want to talk about people. The ideas that you have around a particular group of people or body of people has to come from somewhere. A movie, a book, someone else, oftentimes in the manner of a joke. And comedy in America and these continental United States is often derived based on someone else's identity being the punchline, right? And this goes far back to before the incorporation of the United States, right? That where and how entertainment was done. And we even go back that far to the times when I was talking about Bacon's Rebellion. What was popular at the time, of course, we didn't have electricity the way and access the way we do now, but what was popular was traveling shows and carnival shows. Who was used as entertainment in those shows? People with disabilities, right? People who were born different, people out within the margins of society. And pretty soon, Black and brown people started to be sideshow and circus attractions. Okay, I don't want to go too deep because I don't have a lot of time, but I'm just giving you dropping some nuggets in case you want to follow up with this later. The attitude is usually what comes from how that joke was told to you, right? Sometimes people say, oh, this is really not a good one, but I'm just going to share this joke. Or sometimes it's just how you know someone, right? How they're always telling jokes like this, or they're always like that. It's important to note that when we talk about bias and biased behavior, as I talked earlier, something happens to people when they're in a position of authority, when they are in close proximity to decision-making power. And I'm sorry that this is a little confusing. It's a lot bigger on this screen than I'd seen previously. But what happens in the context of biased behavior is when we are in a group, and this is why the Stroop task is interesting to do in a group if we were able to unmute ourselves and hear what happens. But you saw it happen between Dawn and Porfirio, right? Dawn kind of fell back when she found she wasn't meeting the mark the way she wanted to, right? What happens is if we're in a group setting and we're primed with making a decision on something that impacts someone else's life, if you are by yourself and you're given the responsibility of making a decision, doesn't your demeanor change a little bit? Well, that pool, that grouping of people will shift and change a little bit. This research was conducted among jury duty pools because at some point, the majority of jury duties across this nation were very homogenous. And because of certain laws, policies, and practices, they were primarily white and male. And so this body of research was started over 25 years ago and then wrapped up within the last 10 years. And it looked at how groups of people made decisions about other people, both when they matched their identity and when they were different from their identity. We would say across lines of difference, right? Different identity. And what they found is that if an individual, for instance, was running late or had made a mishap or a mistake and looked like the members of that group, they usually assumed or extended the benefit of the doubt. That happens because when we're in a space, and usually this is, I won't say when we are in a space, but if we are surrounded by people that we believe look like us, usually our brains take a break and will not be as highly scrutinizing as they are when we are in diverse settings. And that is because the assumption is that we share values and we share underlying principles, okay? So let's go back to the jury duty pool, right? We have this group of people who all, for the most part, share identity, and in this instance, we're looking at Black and white groupings of people, or white groupings of people and groupings of people who would be considered in the margins of the margins, melanated individuals, not non-melanated, melanated individuals. So they would be members who would be identified as white would be considered members of the in group, and members who would be considered non-white would be called the out group. In and out because of in the margins and outside of the margins, not in fashion and out of fashion, just to clarify. And what happens in this study is that if an individual's behavior was in question and they matched the identity of the majority, oftentimes the benefit of the doubt was extended, and that person's negative behavior was attributed to an environmental factor. Maybe there was traffic. Maybe they didn't get the Zoom link on time, right? Maybe it's not their fault. Whereas if an individual had demonstrated some negative behavior and was a member of the out group, the members of that in group would language or would define that person based on their character or their personality. And more so say things like, do you think they're taking this seriously, right? Maybe they were out partying last night. Maybe they really are struggling with their time management. Maybe they don't qualify for this job, or maybe they shouldn't be on this jury, right? And ultimately, we've then found that so many of the decisions made in how we determine fairness in our communities and in our emergency rooms and in our classrooms comes from this idea of attribution error. What happens when we're in a group, when we are primed with making important decisions about others, but something else comes along and confuses that as well, and that's called contribution error. And excuse me, confirmation bias. I said I'm looking at attribution. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is what happens because the brain likes to be right. Your brain likes to be so right that, folks, I'm going to give you this tidbit. If you are in a situation and you have to deliver good and bad news, always deliver the good news first if you want that person to be on your side. Because once we hear negative news, it is hard for us to separate out and actually absorb the good news, right? Good news and bad news. I don't know why we play that game. If we want people to be okay with the news we're sharing, share the good news first and share the bad news last, right? But with confirmation bias, what happens is if that individual showed up and was running late, sits down in the seat and goes, ugh, I didn't even turn my alarm on last night. I completely, struggle with time management. They go, aha, I knew all the people that looked like him were always late. Or aha, I knew he didn't take this job seriously and we should never hire someone who looks like them. It is very hard to recalibrate how the brain processes identity difference. It's important to, oh, I'm sorry. I want to get past this because that slide slid in there. Important to note that you're not blind to it because you don't want to acknowledge it or because you wish for a fairer society. It's important to acknowledge that we all have been living in a society, and for the most part, whether you grew up watching a lot of TV or not, so much of our underpinning knowledge, zeitgeist, culture in America is based on identity differences, right? And that so much of these biases can manifest in the workplace. And the reason it's important to address them is because when the human individual experiences an identity harm, it doesn't process it as just a slight. Actually, the body processes it like a trauma. And the reason it does that is because the body cannot tell the difference. Listen to me good. The human brain, rather, cannot tell the difference between a sharp tongue and a sharp object. Does that make sense? Right? Is this a good point? It might be a good point to stop share. Yes. I want to get in here and make sure I'm talking directly to you all. If we all were standing at Times Square, right? We're about to approach the holiday season. Let's just go there. If we're all standing at Times Square and we thought we were about to see the ball drop, and there's 54 of us now on the call. Studies tell us that a third of us are going to run, a third of us are going to freeze in place, and a third of us are going to try to fight or approach. And that is called our trauma response. And what I mean by that is not just us standing there watching the ball or looking up into the sky, but what happens if we're all standing there and a truck backfires down on 39th Street? The sound of a truck backfiring is eruptive, right? And you don't really know what it is. It can sound like a weapon going off. It can sound like a major construction site happening. But what happens in that moment is a third of us will have different reactions. So now say a third of us take off running, boom, straight up Broadway. Some of us freeze in place and some people are gonna run towards the noise to see and check it out, right? Well, when we take off running in that place, what do we all look like if we're all in different identities? The reason I talk about our trauma responses in this moment is because when we have a natural response to harm or we have a natural agitation, yes, your body is going to naturally react. But what does that look like to the public and how will that be received? This is why it's important for us to talk about bias because we all do not have an opportunity to experience a response to stimulus in the same way. And so when it comes to, I'm going to go back to no, I want to stop that for a second. Go back to the slide. Excuse me, when it comes to how we process difference and how we are actually processing and reacting and responding in the moment to a stimulus is the stimulus doesn't have to be a truck backfiring. It can be someone misgendering someone or someone mispronouncing someone's name. And this is a tricky point because often I say, have you ever experienced assuming someone is someone else's identity or mispronouncing someone's name or even misgendering someone? If that happens and the response from the individual is really strong and really doesn't actually match the infraction, you might say, all I did was call them the wrong name. I didn't mean anything by it. Well, no, you didn't mean anything by it. Your intentions were pure, but the impact was sharp. because that person's brain can't delineate the difference between you intending physical harm and you intending emotional harm. And so what happens in that moment is the body goes through the same similar reactions that it would if it were trying to navigate away from physical harm, right? It's important to note that if we are rushing, as you saw with the Stroop task, right? If we're multitasking and our brain is focused on many other dynamics, it will be very difficult for us to override bias. You must slow down. You must focus. You must breathe. And the reason it's important to be mindful of identities is because how we have been raised in America is relative to our comfort, our safety, based on the identities of others. I just want to, and I'm not breezing through this because I've been talking about this, but I want to talk about what happens in identity anxiety. And that is what happens when we interact with someone who is of a different identity across a line of difference. Something dynamic happens if we don't know who that person is or we anticipate that identity. Identity anxiety is an actual physiological stress response. Your heart rate does increase, the body temperature does rise, and there is a diversion. Your brain is thinking of multiple things at a time. Before, during, or after a cross-group interaction. It's what happens when someone knows they're about to be in the minority or the majority in a space, right? The body has a really hard time focusing on the task at hand. This is why it's important to acknowledge bias in the workplace, because when we experience identity anxiety in our work field, it undermines our expertise. Why does it undermine our expertise? Because your brain is having a harder time focusing on facts, details of your work, and it is focused on regulating your heart rate, your blood rate, and your cognitive resources, okay? Something real is happening in the body here. This is why it's important that we acknowledge and I talk about this. And the reason why we talk about this across lines of difference relative to Black and white. Oh, I'm sorry, I don't know why this keeps jumping. Relative to Black and white in the United States is because of how salient Black identity, anti-Blackness is to white identity in America, right? It's not, oh gosh, I wish I could get this to stay. The experience for members of the out group is, will I be treated differently? I've had this experience in the past. I'm anxious and I'm nervous. And so here we are with a little physical, biological response. Whereas for people who are members of the in group, considered or identified as white identified, the concern might be, does not have to be, it might be, will I be perceived negatively? Is someone going to think that what I'm doing is biased or racist or bigoted or is less likely sexist or homophobic? More so, is it based on this racial categorization? And what happens in this moment is the interaction is shorter. So someone is less likely to make eye contact, more likely to avoid asking follow-up questions. So say I'm introduced to someone and I don't know their name or I don't know how to pronounce it properly. I'm less likely to follow up and ask how to do that. Oftentimes in these moments is when weird connections, a joke will be made, an attempt at humor. Someone might try to say, oh, well, you know who you look like? That one other like person of color the only other person of color that I know, not necessarily making a dynamic impact, connection that makes sense. And then what happens in that instance is the person who's been harmed, the person of oftentimes of color in that experience, will have to navigate and tell you, it's okay, I know you didn't mean it. When I just told you that their brain is processing and focusing on. It's really hard for the brain to focus away and in the moment provide support to someone. But this happens all the time, even in our interactions with people we don't know. And so when it comes to work, how we receive information or are assigned projects can be shifted and based on these biased interactions that were awkward oftentimes because people don't know how to what? Apologize or how to reset. I usually ask people if they've experienced identity anxiety before, and if you've experienced it more so in the context of work or outside and after that. And so I'm inviting you to think about that for yourself as you navigate throughout the rest past this training, but also remember, don't try to answer that when we leave each other this evening. It's important to maintain diverse interactions. It's important to think about the interaction across lines of difference. Are you prone to diverting your eyes and not making eye contact? Are you prone to leaning on humor and making a joke or making light of? What about your accent, right? Is your tone changing? Is the frequency with which you respond to a question changing? Does it take longer for you to respond to someone who speaks with an accent, indicating that English may not be their primary language? How are you responding to these things? And prep for it. Practice, right? We practice handshakes, we practice for interviews, practice for these moments. Prime for these moments, meaning think positively of them beforehand. And also think about empowering the people that you serve, right? When it comes to our social impact work, direct impact work, oftentimes we come to this work with a great deal of knowledge and expertise, but the lived expertise and experience of the boots on the ground and the people that we are serving oftentimes needs to be at the center of this, and that will start to help recalibrate how we process difference. I'm leaving this up here for a moment while I share a quick anecdote. If you all think about how strong that sun was a couple of moments ago, think about being on the train platform. I live not too far from the JMZ line in Brooklyn, and sometimes I'm on the train platform and you can't even see people that you're sharing the platform with. And when someone's approaching you, your natural inclination is to want to identify who that person is. Well, if you were born and raised and socialized in these continental United States, meaning you've been here for more than 4 to 6 years, you're starting to take on certain aspects of our culture and society. Your brain wants to know what that individual is, and it's going to skew for 3 characteristics before any other characteristics. And it's going to tell you a lot about how you should move either towards or away from that person. Usually I ask people to guess and name it in the chat, but I'm going to share with you what those 3 characteristics are. The first one is age. Age is the first characteristic by which we oftentimes want to identify someone. And you can tell someone's age by how they walk, the gait, the frequency with which they walk or turn around or move. The second is gender, and right after that is racial categorization. So in this nation, you've been primed to first identify age, gender, race category. Some people would say, oh, but I think I know this phrase. Yes, you do. You are acknowledging it, but this isn't within milliseconds. Within milliseconds. And so if you're watching television or those ID channels, sometimes people will be like, I don't know, it was a guy who's about my age, and then it goes into some of the other characteristics, right? Age is one of the biggest markers of identification, and also something we don't talk about often. But our nation is is sad in that we're one of the only developed nations for which we do not revere age and wisdom. Ultimately, it's important to know names and pronunciations and don't make assumptions about people's identity, and that you keep the emphasis on being open, right? There's always more to learn, not like, I'm never going to get this. I'm done. When you are apologizing, keep in mind that people want to experience normalcy. They don't want to feel like an anomaly. So if you've made a mistake, you've mispronounced someone's name, you've misgendered, or you've misassumed, right? Just just refocus from the apology, from the embarrassment, and don't stress how sorry you are. Please don't stress that what you really truly meant to say, but focus on quickly moving past this dynamic. Stereotype threat is the last phenomenon, and it's helpful that we're at the very last minute or so of our time together. And this is important, and it's the last phenomenon that doesn't require as much attention, primarily because we don't see it all the time. We see its residue from identity anxiety and implicit bias. But it is what happens when a negative stereotype about someone is triggered before they get to a space, and it can undermine your ability to show up. This is interesting in that these studies were conducted primarily on white males and Asian males in a graduate school study to get a sense of what happens when a stereotype or a schema or an idea about us is highlighted, and we have nothing to do with it, of course. That's what a stereotype is. What happens when that is highlighted it starts to override someone's thinking, someone's brain. And again, their body is focused on, and their brain is focused on regulating themselves in that moment. Being aware that people might have certain ideas. So being mindful of whom and how we endorse. I think this is one of the ways in which supervisors and managers and leaders are aware of how the environment, the working environment, can impact how people show up. But oftentimes we can anticipate that bias and we can experience it based on past experience. We can witness it based on past experiences, or we can see how other folk are treated who might share our identity. And that too might undermine our ability to show up. Same thing happens when we experience this threat, except again, this phenomenon is not specific to racial categorization. Almost anyone can experience stereotype threat when they are, again, placed in an experience where they are outmanned, outnumbered. Oftentimes, I talk about what happens when we walk into a police precinct. Most of us are not carrying weapons, right? And we walk into a precinct, you become eerily aware that you are out-armed, right? Your demeanor starts to change. You start to subjugate yourself a little bit to law enforcement in that moment because you are, again, you're vulnerable, and that these things can happen large scale. I see you, Porfirio, in the corner, and I am at the point where we pause. Happy to do so.
Well, first I want to say thank everyone for being here, and I know that some of you have community board meetings now. If you need to pop off, we understand. This will live on our YouTube channel through December 31st. But if there's anyone currently here who has a question or wants to pose one, now would be the time in the Q&A. And while you're doing that, let me just uh, I just want to take a moment to kind of go over some of the bias overrides that you spoke about to just kind of recap. Um, First and foremost, it was interesting that we had those technical issues in the beginning because the full point of everything is when we slow down, actually we actually resolve things in a much better fashion.
Mm-hmm.
And if I may kind of simplify your message, you know, by slowing down, we can create more of a feeling of belonging, a feeling of respect, and an investment in other individuals. We can actually have create moments of conversation and kindness. I love that the last one of the bricks is actually kindness. Um, you know, and by doing that and extending a little grace and patience to each other as community board members, we could actually create a space where we our decision making process is calmer,
Yeah.
more engaged, and less about um, you know an issue, and so that it's more community based. um, and if I may say, that's the whole point of doing this session is to uh, create those tools on how do we slow down and how do we actually engage and have conversations. um, Afua, I learned something every time you come to us. I'm so grateful.
I,
Dawn, thank you for being my co-person with me here and doing the the you know
the test.
the test because and yes I knew what it was about. I had done it before, so not fair that I had a little slight
No, you were
jump.
good. Everybody did exactly how they were supposed to.
So thank you, Dawn. And Afua, I do you have any final words for us?
I appreciate you naming kindness because I usually share this quick anecdote about the difference between kindness and niceness. And I use the experience when we get to TSA, if you fly, anybody flies, or even when you're, I don't know, about to get on a bus, but you get to TSA and if you're moving really fast or you're just overstimulated, right? They'll hand you your documents back and say, have a nice flight. And sometimes you'll say, oh, thanks, you too, right? And then you're going through the oh Lord, the I can't even remember what is it called, the scanner, and you might be like, why did I say you too? They're not going anywhere. It's kind of like when you were a kid and you say like I love you to your teacher, and you're like, that's not the person. It's because you're moving so fast. And that
Yeah.
was a nice encounter. That's being nice. But now think about when you slow down. You get, or when you have time, when you're on time for the airport, right? And they hand you back your documents and they say, thank you, yeah, have a nice trip. And your response is, thanks, I hope you have a break soon. Or I can't believe I got through here so quickly. It's because in that moment, you're not overstimulated. You're all those bits of information have slowed down. So now you can not only be nice, but you make sense.
Yeah.
Right? Being kind is really just slowing down and contextualizing. It's less performative. And I don't want to say like we're just being nice in the moment to be like, okay, great, thanks, bye. But you do know how to perform niceness. We know how to do this dance called relationship and be civil. That extra step, we know you're not getting in the relationship with that TSA agent, but your brain is slowed down enough, and maybe you notice something different, right? In that moment, you realize you're not going to the right gate. You might be at the wrong terminal. You might be have an extra hour to get some coffee. That is how bias is interrupted, and there's so many studies that show us from so many people. I get feedback from judges and clinicians. I got feedback from a trans activist during COVID who said that they had gone to an emergency room and the nurse had misgendered them and just turned around and said, I'm really sorry about that, and just kept on going. And they reached out to me and said, the reason I'm reaching out is because I felt so normal and she didn't have to sit on it. I didn't feel like someone had done, like I was just this weird specimen in her office, that she just said, I'm so sorry, like she would have done to anyone else. So try to help people understand that we all know what it feels like to not feel good in a setting. Slowing down, taking stock of that helps us mitigate this moving forward. So I really appreciate you all bringing me back. It's always, like I said, it's always a pleasure working with New Yorkers. This is a conversation we can have forever. So if anyone ever
Yes,
wants to keep it
yes.
going, reach out. Reach out to me. I'm here. You too, Dawn.
Yeah,
I will.
yeah,
I
yeah.
will.
No,
I
yeah,
learned a lot.
yeah.
Thank
Don't
you. Thank you.
Don and I have conversations all the time about respect and when we do and don't see it. And so I hope that the people who are here and have been part of this, you know, um, it has, you know, allowed you to take that moment to just breathe and see how we see others. Afwa Ado, always a
Thank you
pleasure.
so
Thank you so
much.
much.
Thank you also being so kind earlier with these technical issues. But you all are amazing. And thank you
Well,
for what you do.
our gratitude. All right. Bye bye, everyone. Have a